Deep within the darkest recesses of the human psyche, a terrifying phenomenon exists: cannibal serial killers. These individuals defy comprehension, driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Unfortunately, these monsters are real. Join me as we explore the disturbing world of cannibal serial killers, and examine the twisted motivations behind their heinous crimes. Watch this video till end and you won't believe the number of victims murdered by last one. Before going into content, I'm requesting you to subscribe this channel and support me. Now let's get into content. Number 5. Surinder Kohli is an infamous figure in India known for his involvement in a series of gruesome crimes that came to light in the mid-2000s. Kohli was convicted for the murder of 19 victims and cannibalism of several young girls, which shocked the nation and drew significant media attention. The story began in 2006 when Kohli, who was working as a caretaker in a house in Noida, was implicated in the disappearance of several young girls from the area. The investigation revealed that Kohli lured these girls to his home, where he committed heinous acts against them. He was arrested after police discovered human remains in a nearby area, which led to further inquiries into his activities. During the investigation, Kohli confessed to the murders and admitted to cannibalism, claiming that he consumed parts of the victims. In this confession, Kohli gave a detailed but highly repetitive account of how exactly he lured a total of 16 victims, 9 female children, 2 male children and 5 adult women, into the house, killed and attempted to have sex with the inert bodies, chopped and eat their body parts, and then threw the remains at the back of the house and in the drain on the main road. The case was highly publicized, and Kohli was ultimately convicted in 2009. He was sentenced to death, but the case continued to evoke discussions about safety, justice, and the protection of women and children in society. The story of Surinder Kohli remains a chilling reminder of the potential for human depravity and the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable populations. Kohli's case is often cited in discussions about criminal psychology and the societal factors that contribute to such extreme behaviors. The impact of his crimes has left a lasting mark on the community and has prompted calls for stronger measures to prevent similar incidents in the future. Number 4. Yoo Young-chul was born in 1970 in South Korea and grew up in poverty, which shaped much of his resentment toward society. His childhood was marked by neglect, bullying, and academic failure, leading to a life of petty crimes as he grew older. He was arrested multiple times for theft and fraud, serving time in prison where his anger and bitterness deepened. Yoo developed a particular hatred for wealthy individuals and women, whom he blamed for his struggles and failures in life. In September 2003, he began a killing spree that would last nearly a year. His first targets were wealthy elderly individuals living in Seoul. Posing as a handyman or a potential buyer, he would gain access to their homes. Once inside, he attacked them with a hammer, striking their heads repeatedly until they died. After killing them, he would rob their homes, taking cash and valuables to sustain himself. His early murders were calculated, leaving little evidence for investigators to trace. As his crimes escalated, Yoo shifted his focus to sex workers. He lured them to his home under the pretense of hiring their services. Once they arrived, he killed them using the same method of bludgeoning them with a hammer. Afterward, he dismembered their bodies, often burning the remains or disposing of them in secluded areas to hinder identification. His killings were driven by a deep-seated hatred for women, and he found satisfaction in the violence and control his actions gave him. Yoo claimed that his actions were motivated by a desire for revenge against the wealthy and women, whom he saw as symbols of societal inequality and personal betrayal. He justified his murders as a way of punishing those he believed deserved to suffer. This distorted reasoning fueled his lack of remorse and his continued violence. Despite the increasing number of victims, Yoo evaded capture for months. The police initially failed to connect the murders due to the diverse profiles of his victims and the lack of forensic evidence. Public fear grew as body parts were discovered in public spaces, prompting a more intense investigation. In July 2004, Yoo was arrested on unrelated charges. While in custody, he confessed to killing 20 people, providing detailed accounts of his methods and motivations. His confessions shocked the nation, revealing the meticulous planning and brutality behind his crimes. Yoo showed no remorse, maintaining that his victims deserved their fate and that he had no regrets for what he had done. During his trial, Yu's cold and unrepentant demeanor horrified the public. He was convicted of 20 murders and sentenced to death in December 2004. Despite his sentence, Yu remains on death row, as South Korea has maintained a moratorium on executions since 1997. His case remains one of the most infamous South Korea's history. Number 3. Karl Denk was a German serial killer and cannibal who terrorized the town of Münsterberg, Silesia, now Zeebrugge, Poland, in the 1920s. Denk was born on August 12, 1870, and grew up in a poor farming family. He had a troubled childhood, and his parents were reportedly abusive. As Denk grew older, he became increasingly withdrawn and isolated. He developed a fascination with the occult and began to believe that he had supernatural powers. Denk also became obsessed with the idea of immortality and believed that he could achieve it by consuming human flesh. Denk's killing spree began in 1921, when he started luring homeless men and women to his home with promises of food and shelter. Once they were in his house, Denk would attack and kill them, often using a hammer or an axe. He would then butcher their bodies and cook their flesh in a large pot. Denk's methods were brutal and efficient. He would often target vulnerable individuals, such as the homeless, and use his charisma and charm to gain their trust. Denk's neighbors reported that he would often have large pots of stew cooking on his stove, and they would sometimes catch glimpses of him butchering meat in his backyard. Denk's killing spree continued unabated for several years, and it's estimated that he murdered between 30 and 42 people. However, his luck ran out in 1924, when a man named Emil Kirschner reported Denk to the police. Kirschner had been visiting Denk's home and had become suspicious of his activities. When the police arrived at Denk's home, they found a scene of utter horror. Denk's kitchen was filled with human remains, and his backyard was littered with bones and body parts. Denk was arrested and later confessed to his crimes. Denk's trial was highly publicized, and he was sentenced to death. However, before he could be executed, Denk hanged himself in his prison cell. The exact number of Denk's victims is still unknown, and his case remains one of the most infamous in German criminal history. Denk's motivations for his crimes are still debated among criminologists and psychologists. Some believe that he was driven by a desire for immortality, while others argue that he was motivated by a desire for control and power. Regardless of his motivations, Denk's crimes were heinous and shocking, and they continue to fascinate and horrify people to this day. Number 2. Andrei Chikatilo, born in 1936 in Ukraine, grew up in a period of famine and societal instability, which left him with deep psychological scars. He experienced a troubled childhood marked by stories of cannibalism during the Holodomor and feelings of inadequacy stemming from physical and emotional insecurities. These early experiences contributed to a sense of powerlessness and a disturbing fascination with violence. As an adult, Chikatilo struggled to fit into society despite appearing to lead a normal life. He married, had 2 children, and worked as a teacher and clerk, but he remained socially awkward and plagued by sexual dysfunction. His inability to form meaningful relationships or achieve intimacy fueled his desire to exert control and harm others. Chikatilo's killing spree began in 1978 when he murdered a 9-year-old girl, Yelena Zakotnova. He lured her into a secluded area, attacked her, and killed her in a fit of sexual violence. Although he was initially not caught, this murder marked the beginning of his escalating pattern of violence. Over the next 12 years, he killed more than 50 people, targeting vulnerable individuals such as children, teenagers, and young women. He typically approached his victims in public places like train stations or bus stops, gaining their trust with promises of help, food, or money. Once he had lured them to isolated locations, he would unleash brutal violence. He stabbed his victims repeatedly, often using a knife or other sharp objects. His killings were marked by extreme overkill, including mutilation, disembowelment, and removal of body parts. Chikatilo took particular pleasure in gouging out his victims' eyes, believing it would prevent them from remembering him in the afterlife. His acts of mutilation were both a source of sexual gratification and a way to assert dominance over his victims. Chikatilo's crimes were compounded by his ability to evade capture for years. The Soviet police struggled to investigate his murders due to a combination of limited resources, mismanagement, and the political climate of the time, which resisted acknowledging the existence of serial killers. Many innocent individuals were wrongfully accused and even executed during the investigation. Meanwhile, Chikatilo's seemingly unremarkable demeanor allowed him to blend into society and escape suspicion. In 1990, he was arrested after exhibiting suspicious behavior near a train station in an area where a recent murder had occurred. Following his arrest, he confessed in horrifying detail to killing 56 people, though he was officially charged with 53 murders due to lack of evidence in some cases. During his trial in 1992, his erratic and bizarre behavior shocked the court, as he recounted his crimes and revealed the depravity of his actions. He was convicted and sentenced to death. Chikatilo was executed by a gunshot to the head in 1994, bringing an end to one of the most horrifying criminal cases in history. His reign of terror left an indelible mark on the victims' families and the broader society, serving as a chilling reminder of darkness. Number 1. Luis Garavito's story begins in the heart of Colombia, where a boy grew up in an environment steeped in violence, poverty, and neglect. From a young age, Garavito endured severe abuse at the hands of his father and others, experiences that would twist his mind and set him on a path of unimaginable horror. The pain and trauma of his childhood created a fractured individual who would later unleash his darkness on the most innocent and vulnerable. As an adult, Garavito became known as La Bestia, the Beast, a name that barely encapsulates the terror he spread across Colombia in the 1990s. His targets were street children, boys aged 6 to 16, often living on the fringes of society, forgotten and unprotected. Garavito used charm, deception, and disguises to lure his victims. He dressed as a priest, a teacher, or a beggar, promising food, work, or money to gain their trust. Once he isolated them, his true nature emerged. He would lead the children to remote areas, far from prying eyes, where his monstrous acts would unfold. Bound and helpless, his victims endured hours of torture before meeting a gruesome death. Garavito admitted to taking pleasure in their suffering, his actions driven by a dark and insatiable compulsion. The level of brutality was almost beyond comprehension. His victims bore signs of unimaginable pain, their lives snuffed out in fear and agony. For years, the disappearances of these boys went unnoticed or were brushed aside, a grim reflection of societal indifference toward the marginalized. It wasn't until mass graves began to surface that the full extent of the horror came to light. Police discovered evidence linking Garavito to the killing glasses, notebooks, and receipts left behind at crime scenes. When he was finally arrested in 1999, his capture felt like a moment of justice, though what followed would challenge that notion. During his interrogation, Garavito confessed to the murder of 140 children, though he hinted that the number could be over 200. He provided chillingly detailed accounts of his crimes, his calm demeanor only amplifying the horror. The court sentenced him to an astronomical 1,853 years in prison, a number that seemed fitting for his monstrous deeds. However, Colombian law limited any prison sentence to 40 years, and due to his cooperation with authorities and good behavior, his time was reduced even further. This revelation sparked outrage, as people grappled with the idea that someone responsible for such atrocities could ever walk free. Garavito's case became a flashpoint for debates about justice, rehabilitation, and the limits of legal systems. Despite being imprisoned, his legacy of terror continues to haunt Colombia, a grim reminder of how unchecked evil can flourish when the most vulnerable are ignored. Luis Garavito's story is one of pain, evil, and unanswered questions. It forces us to confront the darkest corners of humanity and the systems that failed to protect those who needed it most. His name remains synonymous with terror, his actions a scar on the collective conscience of a nation. As we conclude this video today, join the conversation in the comments section below and share your thoughts on these disturbing cases. What drives someone to become a cannibal serial killer? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more true crime content, and leave a comment if you want part 2. And thanks for watching. See you in next with an interesting video.